Hello again. Thank you for joining me once again. If you're here with me now in chapter 8, then you have staying power. We only have to get to chapter 12, so we are getting there. What happened in chapter 7? We had the conclusion of the Morris Chabalala episode. Tsotsi learning from Morris Chabalala to show mercy and to feel for his victim. And Morris Chabalala learning an interesting lesson from Tsotsi that he still wants to live. So in chapter 8, if you see what's on the screen now, you see we've got this church again. We had the church just for a second a couple of chapters ago, raising this question in our minds: is this church going to offer any kind of relief for this terrible world that we're seeing, this dystopian apartheid world? It's so gritty and so crooked and so unpleasant to look at. We're not going to get an answer to that question here. It's very brief, a bit about the church. And then we're going to meet a new character whom we actually have met once before. Her name is Miriam Ngidi, but when we met her earlier, we didn't know her name. It was simply a young and attractive woman that the guys in the gang saw out in the streets, and they saw she was with a child, and it said that it gave Tsotsi an idea. And if we read between the lines, then the idea was, here's someone who might be able to feed the baby. And there's a long description of the single tap in a large area of the township, and that's where Tsotsi is going to meet her again. But let's do this church bit first, chapter 8. The bell of the Church of Christ the Redeemer is tolling. It has a double stroke. Ding, dong, gong, gong. Ding, gong, gong, gong. In the pauses, the echo of the last note floats away from the belfry, the bell tower, low over the rooftops, circling the township like a heavy and grey bird. The shadow of its passing is Sunday. And it rings again. And some people are standing around the church door, waiting to go inside and hear the organ and sing the hymn. The rest stay behind in the trees, sitting on steps or just standing, but all of them in the sun. They also hear and respond faithfully. Sunday again, once a week, and always on time. They come together like a woman and her baby. Take one and you also get the other. It's heard in the rooms, this bell. There are many still asleep, in beds, on sleeping mats, with blankets or without, coupled or alone. The sound settles in the room, and they nestle deep in its feathered melancholy, its flying sadness, and drift off to another sleep. Somewhere Boston hears it. It's a soft sound, so he listens, letting it wrap around the fragile splinter of his consciousness. He is looking at a small piece of naked skin with one eye. The other is closed. He notices that hairs grow out of tiny pinhead depressions. He doesn't know where he is, what time it is, nor what's going to happen next. He doesn't recognize his own arm. He hears the bell and minutely studies the skin and the hair. Nothing else exists, and he doesn't dare move for fear of pain or shame. A door slams somewhere and he hears footsteps. The feet are bare and are walking on wood. He hears his terror. It's a thin screaming note in his ears that magnifies the footfall and silences the bell. Don't come near me, he thinks hysterically. Don't touch me or talk to me. Ding, dong, 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 dong. Ding, dong, 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 dong. The Reverend, we're going to meet him again, and he's the one, I think, who buried Gambu Dlamini a couple chapters ago. So he gets up from his knees in his room. On his way to the door, he passes the window. He stops and looks out. He recognizes the deceit in this small action. It's the desire to see and not be seen. They are shuffling into the church, shuffling their feet on the mat at the door before going in. The feeling is there before he knows it. He finds himself angry, impotently angry with their best-suited, unsmiling and stiff devotions. Go home, he wants to shout. Go home. It's no good I didn't know his name, and that is referring to Gambu Dlamini. Instead, he fumbles in his haste to open the door and cross to the church. He prays on the way, God help me. And that's the church episode, this brief episode at the beginning of the chapter. So that he refers to the Reverend Ransom. This he is going to refer to Tsotsi, returning to the baby in the ruins. The last time he'd seen the baby is when he fed it the condensed milk. He saw it as he came through the doorway, stepping lightly among the fallen bricks. He saw it clearly as an uncertain line that was scrawled all the way down the yellow peeling plaster, right down to the shoebox, then over it and into the corner beyond. Seeing it, he stopped, and with the strange irrelevance of a panicky mind, he remembered an idle moment one afternoon with the others in his room, when his hands had found a pencil that Boston had left on the table. He had toyed with it for a few seconds, leaving a scribble of lines on the tabletop, playing with it like that, until he'd looked up and seen something in Boston's eyes that made him angry and deliberately break the pencil. Even though what he saw now on the wall was as meaningless, he studied it so intently that when he spoke, it was as if he had deciphered a strange script and was reading the message. Ants, he murmured aloud. Jesus, ants. It was the condensed milk, of course. The top of the tin was an unbroken liquid brown mass of them that spilt onto his hands when he picked it up. So great was his horror of them that when he felt them swarming over his fingers, he dropped the tin and rubbed his hand furiously on his trousers. So it's not just spiders he's scared of. They were now pouring in an unending stream out of the 2 holes he'd punctured in the top, as if they'd rested inside at the very heart of the sweetness. The spoon was just as bad. A crystal white crust of the milk had dried on it, and the ants seethed over it in a drunken orgy of excitement. Tsotsi turned to the shoebox last of all. He was almost too frightened to lift the lid. The baby lay quiet, in a sleep so close to death he believed it to be that, until a bubble rose to his mouth and burst into its mouth and burst silently, leaving a thin smear of spit to trickle away down the side to the waiting ants. There weren't many. It couldn't have been long since they'd found a way in, but they were there, wringing the opened mouth like the thin edge of another lip. The foul stench, the bad smell, again came from the box. With this first look came an overwhelming sense of despair. Tsotsi knew it was a crisis, and that he'd come either with minutes to spare or minutes too late, that the baby might die from all these ants. He fought down a sudden desire to throw the lot, baby, condensed milk and spoon, deep into the ruins and never come back again. Instead, he took a deep breath, held it in, and went to work. First, he got rid of the ants on the face. The baby awoke once in the course of this and cried feebly, moving his head a little to one side. Tsotsi noticed that the eyes had lost their focus. They were weak and watery, and stared with a terrible vacancy, a terrible nothingness up at nothing. It took him a few minutes to kill all the ants, pinching them between his thumb and forefinger. Then he moved the box away from that corner to another, where there was also shade, but no ants. He went back to the wall to deal with a column of ants on the plaster. With his flat hand and starting at the bottom, he began to stop it, grinding and rubbing his hand each time to make sure there was not a single survivor. The top of the column was out of his reach, so he piled up a few bricks and, standing on that, dealt with it in the same fashion. His last reckoning with the ants was to shake and blow the tin and spoon clean of them, and then to stomp violently around the corner where they swarmed on the earth in a minute panic, a small panic. Finally, he shoveled sand over the spot with his feet. He went back to the other corner and looked down at the baby. A few survivors had crawled out of the folds of his swaddling clothes onto his face, his nappies, or what Tsotsi is using as nappies for him, or diapers. Tsotsi killed them using the same technique of thumb and forefinger before sitting down beside it with his back to the wall. He felt better. Killing the ants had restored some of his confidence, but the urgency of the situation remained, even more so now that he was able to see the baby unobscured by his first feelings of panic and despair. Tsotsi had dealt too long in death not to feel its imminent presence in the shoebox. Imminent means it's coming soon. The baby needed a lot, and he needed it quickly. Food, he thought. It must have food. It must also be cleaned again and wrapped up in other clothes. But food first. The condensed milk was useless. After he'd cleaned the tin and spoon of a few struggling ants and blown into one of the holes to get out a spoonful, because it didn't come easily, it was to find as many ants drowned and bogged down in the milk as he'd found on top of the tin. Tsotsi left the corner and, standing on the remains of a wall, hurled or threw the tin and spoon with all his force deep into the ruins. He remembered the cripple, Morris Shabalala. Last night, he thought, it is past. This is today, another strange day, a new day with the changes that Tsotsi has been through. He left the wall and broke the momentum of thoughts that threatened to carry him away from the present. Milk. I must get milk for him. He went down onto his knees and bent close to the baby, as if it might whisper a few words of advice or encouragement. He studied the face intently. Those eyes, they made him feel he wasn't there. Tsotsi brushed his fingers past in front of them. They didn't blink. The baby's breathing came in shallow, fretful little sighs, ending with a tick, 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 tick from deep in its throat, as if something there were counting off a few seconds for every breath. A few seconds of what? Tsotsi put out a finger and touched the small pink palm of one hand, and the fingers closed on his like the tendrils of a lazy anemone, a sea plant, I think it is. He felt the tiny moist hold with a palpitating heart. He had a name for his experience of that moment. He was feeling for the baby. He remembered the cripple again. And here's a picture of an anemone, so you can understand how the baby's finger is being compared to this sea plant. You remember the cripple again. After a few seconds, why is he thinking of the cripple? Because he nice feeling for the baby. He felt for the cripple, Morris. Nice feeling for the baby. After a few seconds, he pulled away his hand, stood up, and wiped away the moustache of sweat droplets on his upper lip. What was he going to do? Milk. He said the word aloud so as to rivet his attention to the problem. What was it to be? Another tin from the Indian trader? He almost accepted the thought because of the immediate avenue of action it offered him. But Tsotsi had lost faith in condensed milk and in the ability of his clumsy hands to minister to the needs of the baby. So he's looking at the smudge on the wall of the ants where he'd attacked the column of ants and had been penciled in lightly against there's more ants. He repeated his first strategy, but this time using both hands, slapping so violently that his palm stung. It was while doing this that he remembered the thought Butcher had suggested the previous afternoon when he teased the woman. Butcher was just making a sleazy comment to this woman he saw with a baby. But to Tsotsi, it's more than just a sleazy comment. She could really be someone who could help him with this child. Tsotsi went back to the baby with only half the new column of ants disposed of. He sat beside the baby with this thought for a long time, because it was a long thought, and took its time in passing before he knew its beginning and its end. But when he did, it was also to know the end of his dilemma, his decision. He had a plan, and as the final part of it, he stood up and took the baby out of the box, abandoning the box, because the stinking yellow muck from the clothes between its legs had soaked through to the cardboard. The box, was useless now, the bottom having gone soft and soggy. Tsotsi wrapped up the baby in its coat and left the ruin. So now we're coming to this communal tap. This tap in the township that so many people use, and that's where we're going to meet Miriam Ngidi again. And that's where Tsotsi's going to see her, and he's got his own way of persuading her to come to his room. There's quite a bit about this tap. At the bottom of the street, not far from Tsotsi's room, you could lean out of his window and see the spot. There where the road had managed to steal the extra inches of land from the shacks and hovels that crowded the side in a warped frontage of corrugated iron, biscuit tins, packing case wood, sacking, and of anything else that could be nailed or tied together in the basic design of a few walls and a roof. There in this widening of the street, littered with stones because feet, thousands of them, to be numbered in generations of coming and going, had worked away the loose sand, tramped down the remainder, hard and firm. There in the middle of all this, snaking out of the earth in a length of grey piping, and this firm on a 3-foot beam of wood, buried deep on the day when the ground had been soft and easy on the spade, there, solitary, important, indispensable, we couldn't do without it, hated at times, enjoyed at others, stood the communal tap. It's a very clever, is this a loose or periodic sentence? It's a periodic sentence ending with this main idea of the communal tap. We've got to wait to hear what is this thing. This part of the street was known as Waterworks Square, and the tap was the only one in that part of the township. They came to it, starting early in the morning, and then all through the day, still there when the sun set, and then after that returning intermittently through the night to chase away the dogs gathered to lick up the drip, yet all it gave was water. They came to it with buckets and basins and babies on their backs and in their bellies. They came to it old and young, some so young they never remembered. The oldest now so far gone in living that at their last the most they could do was shuffle with the queue and keep a place for an absent one, and all it gave was water. They came to it laughing, they came to it silent or singing or sad, and to all it only gave water. And because they had to wait so long for it, at noon the queue would stretch back past Tsotsi's room, because there stranger met stranger in a common purpose, a common thirst, and you could talk there waiting in the queue about nothing or everything, and never meet again, because there you could see the face of the baby heard being born last night, or that of the man who prayed so long and loud, or the one who beat his wife, or the wife herself, blacker for bruises. Because of all this, more than just waiting for water, a dull enforced drag of hours wasted in the sun while you shuffled nearer the tap. That stocky length of wood and gurgling pipe was rooted in their lives. In the Church of Christ the Redeemer, its water was sprinkled on the newborn in a double baptism, because the children, especially as soon as they could walk and carry, were sent into its servitude. In the same church there'd been a sermon on patience the Sunday after the melee, the fight amongst the women when the water was cut off. In the deeper intimacy of the smoke-filled rooms, in the living breath of their language, it had been raised to the pedestal of idiom. It was a language sharpened by wits, so that talk at the tap caught click and consonant of women idle at gossip as they moved in starts nearer the water, and sharpened by truth in sweet as the water, because there was the story of old Jenkins Malopopo, who'd stood his turn through a hot day empty-handed so that he could have his last drink from it, straight from the tap, you see, and then die. And birth too. And this story lived in the words, "A baby is born between drops," because one had been there beside it in the sun, and the mother had stood up afterwards and waited because her paraffin tin was not yet full. She's given birth in the queue. And here's not the first time we see Miriam, but where we find out her name. Among those who took their turn in the queue that Sunday afternoon was Miriam Ngidi. She was 18 years old and carried her baby on her back. When she reached the queue, she put down her paraffin tin and prepared herself with a sigh of resignation for the long wait that lay ahead until she reached the tap. She's resigned to her fate. She's sighing and thinking, oh, here we go, here's this long wait. It would take her half an hour. That was one of the things you learnt in the township, without ever actually being taught, how to measure the time of a queue by its length. And I'll skip this here, but it's not just a question of how long is the queue. It's also got to do with how much water is coming out of the tap, what time of day it is. So on this day, she reckons it's half an hour that she'll have to wait. Her baby was awake. He hadn't cried once during the walk from the room. And for the past few minutes, he hadn't even moved, not even to pick at the ends of the knotted doek on her head, which was his favourite game. Yet she knew he was awake. It's still the same, she thought, in my stomach and now on my back. I still know when he's awake or sleeping, then without being able to see, and now without having to look. But she does look and sees the child with his thumb, and he jerks his hand at his mouth and waves as if there's a friend wave in the distance. A bolt of pride surged through her. Her son, hers, Miriam Ngidi's baby, the man they would call Simon. He's going to grow up to be called Simon, but we find out very soon that Miriam Ngidi's husband was Simon, and he disappeared. She picked up a paraffin tin and hurried forward. The queue had moved a few precious feet. When she stopped again, it was to look down at the ground. The baby was going to sleep. But she's always asking herself, Simon, where are you? Simon, my man, where are you? My man, where are you? About the husband who disappeared. She saw the face so clearly. If she looked hard enough, she could see it in anything. And so clearly he had only to open his mouth and speak. Simon, where are you? What happened? What? Where are you now? How was it that a man, a full-blooded, big-bodied man who had fathered a child and a woman in love, could walk to work one day and never come back? But that's what happened. She's been, searching for him for 8 months, and there was just no sign of him, no word, no memory. It was during the taxi strike. Simon, where are you? The queue's moving again, this old man speaking to her. He's saying that the young people jump in front of you in the queue. He's brought tea. He asked her name and her age, where she came from. She wants to ask him, where's the Simon? My husband, she said. He listened gravely, pretending not to notice the lump that was choking back her words. She's still emotional, wants to cry about her husband. He went to work and didn't come back. There were many like that, he said. Did you see him by any chance? She tells his name. But she saw the answer in his eyes. The answer is clearly no, he doesn't know where the husband is. When it came to her turn at the tap, she turned around and asked him for his tin and filled that first, and then waited while the tap ran into hers. When it was full, another woman helped her get it onto her head. She walked with her eyes fixed straight ahead, moving her legs as if the water in the paraffin tin on her head ran through her body and into them. So she's got incredible grace the way she walks, balancing this water. She managed not to think on the way back to her room, so that when she reached it, the pain had passed, the pain of thinking about her husband. And in between putting the baby to sleep and the water on to boil, because she was now earning a living for herself and the child as a wash girl, she was able to think about what the old man had said without wanting to cry. He was right, of course. Many had gone like Simon, swallowed up by the earth, it seemed, on the dark mornings of the boycott and whisked away before word could be got home. What he hadn't said was that most of them had come back since, to tell the same stories of summary trial followed by a few weeks in jail. Simon was one of the significant few who had not returned. But she carries on living bravely, doing washing, odd cleaning jobs in the white suburb. She seldom smiled now, kept to herself and the baby, asked no favours and gave none, hoarding it as it were the moments and things in her life. Hoarding, as it were, the moments and things in her life. And this is where Tsotsi, he's followed her from the tap and come to knocking on her door. The knock on the door has always quickened her with a moment of excitement, until she reminded herself that Simon would never have knocked. She'd wandered so far away from the day-to-day realities of her life in the room in the township that for a few moments after opening the door she saw him as just another young man. "What do you want?" she asked. He just shrugged his shoulders. It was the next movement of his, looking back to make sure that no one was about, that brought her down to earth. Miriam tried to slam the door, but he was quicker and got his foot against it. Before she'd even thought of screaming, he had his hand against her mouth and had forced her back inside and into a chair, kicking the door closed behind him. Her panic passed quickly into a blind, overwhelming fear for her baby. Involuntarily, she looked to the bed. He saw this. "If you try to run away or scream, I'll kill your child," he said. When she shook her head agitatedly, he released her. Miriam watched him. When he went to the bed where her child lay, every muscle in her body and in her throat tensed for a frenzied attack. She's ready to attack Tsotsi with the love of a mother. But he did nothing to release this attack. Only bending down for a long and good look at the baby, he turned back to her. "Come," he said, and moved to the door. The first time he'd spoken almost impassively. Now in that one word there brooded a weight of something as somber as thunder, as serious as thunder. Miriam shook her head. "Come!" His voice was loud and hard. She didn't shake her head this time, but still she made no move. "If you don't come, I'll kill your baby. It won't take long." She shrunk back at his last words. He knew why, but it was a complicated thought to contradict. So he said, "It's not that." "And what does he mean?" "He means, I'm not going to rape you." "What then?" "Come," he roared, and smashed a cup to the floor. "Can I leave the child?" "Yes." "Can I get somebody to take him?" "It won't take long. You'll be back." So he wants her to leave her child in her room and follow him to his room, where his so-called his baby is. He walked ahead. She followed at a few paces, and not once did he look back to see if she was there. He's that confident in himself. Only when they reached the door to his room did he turn and point, so that she went in first. Tsotsi closed the door behind them, and Miriam pressed herself up against the wall, so that he had to drag her by the wrist to the bed. She began to moan softly, but stopped when she saw the baby. He let her have a good look before speaking. "Feed it." She showed no understanding of his words, and because he had no others, he put out his hands and with one wrench tore open her blouse, exposing her breasts. There was no vest or brassiere or bra. "Feed it," he said again. She brought up her arms to cover herself and backed away from the bed, shaking her head. It was worse than what she'd first thought he wanted. This baby looks so dirty and awful that this is worse than the idea of being raped by him. The thought of that greedy, decrepit, foul-smelling bundle in the rags on the bed at her breast filled her with horror. It was a violation of her body that brought to a sharp pitch the possessive, miserly twist in her nature. Miserly, she doesn't want to give her milk away to the strange baby. "He's too dirty," Miriam cried. "Then clean him," Tsotsi said savagely. "Clean him and feed him." When she still hesitated, he took out his knife and gave her one last chance. "Now," he said, "now, or I go back for yours." Miriam fought down her disgust and went to work. She washed the baby in a basin of water which he provided, and when that was finished, wrapped him up as best she could in the rags which came out of Tsotsi's clothes box in the corner. Once the baby was washed and cleaned, her first revulsion or dislike for him was past, or disgust, but there still remained the feeding. There was no point in delaying it. Closing her eyes and cradling the baby on her lap, she put her nipple into his mouth. Her breasts were dry when he started sucking, but she knew enough to wait patiently and let him continue. With the first pull of his greedy mouth on the nipple, a sudden wave of erotic feeling passed through her body. With an imperceptible movement, her thighs relaxed. If Tsotsi had meant what she'd first thought to be his intentions and had taken her at that moment, she wouldn't have fought him for long. She would have given in to Tsotsi if he'd wanted to rape her at this point. The baby had had that effect on her, and before long his alien, rapacious or greedy sucking opened the deepest reservoirs of her milk. He drank deeply. At the end of half an hour, Miriam took him away from her second breast with a feeling of tremendous physical fatigue. "She's exhausted." "He's had enough," she said quickly. Tsotsi had been at the window looking into the street all that time. He watched her bounce the baby on her lap for a while, rubbing his back, before wrapping him up and putting him down on the bed. He lay quietly. Very gently she touched the raw patches around his mouth with her fingertips and looked at Tsotsi inquiringly, as though to ask, "What those red patchy bits around his mouth?" "Ants," he said. She didn't seem to understand, so he said it a second time, "Ants, man, on the wall." But she didn't understand, or wouldn't believe him. So he closed his eyes for a few seconds and said nothing more. Miriam buttoned up her blouse and tucked it into her skirt. She hesitated at the bed, as if uncertain whether to stand up or to stay longer. Again at the door, only a few steps away from the freedom of the street, she hesitated with her hand on the doorknob, looking back at the bed. "Where's his mother?" she asked. Tsotsi shrugged his shoulders. He'd lost all interest in her now. She's done what he wanted. Miriam stole a quick searching look at him, and then fiddled unnecessarily with her blouse. "A bitch," she said, and she means a dog. "A bitch in a backyard would look after its puppies better. She thinks it's his baby, that he's not looked after it well." The words had a strange effect on Tsotsi. He turned slowly away from the window and looked at her with large, frightened eyes. "No," he whispered. Miriam thought he said go. She opened the door, then closed it behind her and walked home. So that's the Miriam Ngidi episode. So it's Sunday night. And this is just what people say on Sunday nights. Let's just pick it up here with Baby and Tsotsi. Tsotsi sat through it all, the Sunday night, wide awake through all the time that had passed since the woman left. still wide awake now with sleep lapping like a black tide through the township streets. The baby had cried once, and he'd carried it until it stopped, then put it back on the bed and gone to his seat in the corner. He had no desire for movement. He was frightened of anything that threatened to disturb the memory that had come to him from a long time away. So he kept quiet and sat in the dark and remembered it again from beginning to end. He remembered it again and again, pausing only in the deep silence between each reliving to wonder how he had ever forgotten. And that's the chapter, and we're soon going to find out what some of his memories are. But in the meanwhile, he's done his duty in that he's had the baby properly fed by Miriam Ngidi. I'll encourage you to remember her name, Miriam Ngidi. She does stay in the novel after this. We made it to the end of chapter 8, was it? 9, 10, 11, 12. 4 chapters to go. We are 2/3 of the way through the novel. So you're doing pretty well. Thank you once again for joining me, and I wish you a lovely day.